Welcome to Allow Us to Explain from Our National Conversation. My name is Christopher No, a podcasting intern here at ONC. And today we are going to be discussing the BDS movement, or the Boycott, Divestments, and Sanctions movement, which I had never heard of before. I knew there was a lot of calls on college campuses, especially last year, to divest. A lot of calls for boycotts. I had never heard that there was actually a movement, but the BDS describes itself as a nonviolent Palestinian-led movement promoting boycotts, divestments, and economic sanctions against Israel. And joining us on today's conversation, we have Maeve Fischel, a policy content writer here at ONC. Hi, Maeve. How are you?
Good, thanks for having me.
And we also have Ryan Dulaney, right? Right. Did I get that right? For a second, I was
Yep.
like, is it Rob Dulaney? No, it's Ryan Dulaney. Ryan Dulaney, also a policy content writer here at ONC. How are you doing, Ryan?
Good. Glad to be here, Chris. Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining us. What is a policy content writer here at ONC, though? What do you guys do?
Every week we are assigned a kind of assignment. Usually it's an op-ed in general, and we go search out a topic. We all have specializations. So like me personally on foreign policy. So whatever's kind of going on in the news or I think is interesting or important, I research it and write about a 750 word opinion piece. And then we have a writers meeting and then it gets published. That's what we do every week.
Oh, excellent. Are you also foreign policy, Maeve, or do you have another area of expertise?
I'm actually more social issues, but it gives us a very wide bandwidth of topics to work with.
Oh, great. Well, today's conversation combines both foreign policy with social issues, so we're glad to have you two here. Let's just introduce what the BDS is real quick, because I'm sure a lot of people listening haven't heard of it. I myself didn't hear of it. But BDS was officially founded in 2005. It is not a new thing. It's not a recent reaction to the what's going on in Israel and Palestine right now. Its roots were in 2005. I mean, arguably you could trace those roots back further, but let's just go with 2005. The movement itself models itself after the anti-apartheid movement, which was a successful boycott waged against apartheid South Africa from 1960 to 1994. And I believe the BDS movement has three primary goals. Ryan, what are those three primary goals?
Oh yeah, sure. So the first goal is ending the occupation of the Arab land, specifically in the West Bank, but it kind of varies. But most specifically, the Arab lands in the West Bank since 1967, which was a war that had happened in that time where Israel seized or annexed more land in the West Bank than they had had previously from the 1948 border. The second, I guess, principle that they're operating under is recognizing the rights of Palestinian citizens in Israel. So a lot of Palestinians in Israel are second-class citizens, much like Black South Africans were in apartheid Africa. So recognizing those rights and putting pressure on Israel through boycott, divestment, and sanctions in order to fix that and alleviate that problem. And then the third point is respecting the right to return for Palestinians who have been ousted from their lands since 1948 and on. So the UN recognized the two-state solution, I think around 1947, and it recognized lands that are entitled to Palestinians and lands that are entitled to Israeli Jews. And the third point just recognizes that Palestinians should have the right to return under those UN resolutions.
And I don't believe that BDS takes a stand on two state, one state or anything. It's just these three goals that BDS is primarily concerned with. Although when you look at the three goals, it's kind of hard to look at them and not like think that the BDS is probably for a two-state solution,
Yeah.
specifically that third goal. And I'm wondering, is the third goal, and maybe you could help answer this, is the third goal practical in and of itself, the right to return? Or does that, in an essence, because of like the controversy of that goal, does it hinder the movement at all? What do you think about that?
Sure, thank you. I think that's been a very common argument among not just the BDS movement, but a lot of the peace efforts you've seen initiated by other groups to address the ongoing issues between Israel and the Palestinian people. And my response to that is, I think, as it was outlined in the initial resolution, you can't really have a comprehensive strategy towards peace and towards restitution if you don't include the right to return element. I think if you're really trying to reconcile and rectify some historical errors which involve displacement and dispossession of land, then you can't have a fully comprehensive and viable strategy towards long-term peace if you don't also include the component of land to return and right to return to land. So for me, it's a bit indispensable. And while I can sort of understand why people might think it complicates the peace efforts, I think it's also very much a contingent part of those efforts.
I guess what I was curious of is if it's so controversial and the goal is primary goal is to get Israel to stop to end the occupation. That's like the big goal here, is to end this occupation that's been going on since I believe the Israel occupation is going on since 1967. Is that correct? Um, and now I've heard a couple things about the right to return. I've heard there are three possible things about right of return. There is that there's just the physical right to return, that Palestinian refugees have the physical right to return to their homes or their homeland in Israel. But then there's also that they could be compensated. Right. But then there's also this thing that I heard about, and I don't know, Ryan, maybe you could talk about this. There's the symbolic right to return, which I'm a little confused by. Ryan, can you clarify a little bit of the symbolic right to return, what that would entail?
Yeah, what I would imagine that is referring to is Israel's actually been increasingly populated by Jewish citizens since like 1919, the Palestine Mandate, and in 1948 it officially became a state, and many people that were ousted and victims of the Holocaust in Europe actually moved to Israel, so that increased that population even more. And the British tried to kind of keep a lid on this complicated situation by having a military force there. And sometimes that included forcing Palestinians out of their homes. Sometimes that included quelling kind of violent riot-like behavior on both sides because it's very contentious. And then in 1948 is when the Nakba happens and many of these people are displaced. So I imagine a symbolic right to return is kind of like a symbolic justice, if you would, because they feel like many generations ago their ancestors were done wrong, and they think the symbolic right to return would right this historical wrong. And really, I don't know. It's a complicated situation in general, obviously, but I don't know how, like personally, like when you asked about the realistic situation of this earlier, I think the symbolic aspect is more referencing international law and justice than it is actual practical reality. Because these Israelis have been living in these houses that are, by international law, owned by Palestinian citizens or were until they were ousted. I don't know that you're going to be able to get someone that's been living there for 3 generations to willingly give that up without force. And the Israeli military and the Israeli government in general is not particularly progressive or open to listening to international law in a situation like this, I would imagine. But yeah, the symbolic right to return, I think, is kind of righting that historical wrong in general.
And the idea is that the BDS movement is a nonviolent way to achieve these aims. It's the violence has plagued the Middle East for as long as I've been alive, as long as my parents have been alive. It's very terrible atrocities on both sides, but boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Now, I've heard criticism that it might as well just be called the BD movement because there's no sanctions actually happening, like between Western countries to Israel. There's no sanctions. So, and I know in terms of South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement, that succeeded primarily because of sanctions. So I'm wondering, like, what is the challenge here for the BDS movement to create pressure on Israel without formal governmental sanctions? And how is this something that can achieve some of the success of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa achieved without its major pressure point? Maeve, do you want to explain any of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So far in the history of the BDS movement, you've seen some headway with companies who were pressured or persuaded to end their business in Israel or in Israeli territories because of the mounting pressure from pro-Palestinian groups to sever those ties. I think there's been multiple businesses. I'm pretty sure even that one ice cream chain, Ben and Jerry's, removed all their locations from Israel and particularly from the occupied territories. And so I think that's an example of how private companies and independent businesses can have an impact in helping advance this movement without necessarily involving the government. Um, and I think also it serves as a means of just further amplifying the cause. I think when you establish this precedent that we won't do business in this country as long as it's in violation of international law, that automatically lends more credence and legitimacy to the claims of wrongdoing that people in the Palestinian community have been voicing for many decades. So to your point, it may not be sanctions, although the sanctions movement is also gaining some headway. I think Australia just imposed sanctions on Israel within the past 3 days. So that's also been, I
Oh,
think,
what sanctions did they impose? I have not heard of that.
yeah, I don't know all the specifics, but it was specifically on the Israeli settlers. It says here, yeah, certain groups in the occupied West Bank, and also imposing sanctions on uh, as well as travel bans on Israel. So I think they're an example of how countries are taking a much firmer stance against Israel right now. I think especially given the past 9 to 10 months of the war in Gaza. So it's gaining some momentum, I would say.
Okay, that's interesting. So basically, the boycott and divestment calls, which a lot of that onus is on the people to carry out,
Mhm.
in and of itself, like the big raises awareness and can lead eventually to what they hope to be government in the future government sanctions. So, but then I think about the boycott and I think about like how I don't know how I don't believe it's negatively affecting Israel's economy. And I was looking into that and I was looking at this list. Actually, I don't know if you've seen this. It's Israel's top 10 exports. You have electric machine. This is like 80% of the overall value of global Israeli shipments. And it's electrical machinery, technical medical apparatus, precious metals, machinery, minerals, chemicals, plastics, aircraft, spacecrafts, fertile. I'm just wondering, like, how can people actually carry out these boycotts? Because right now you see people, it's like Airbnb is not doing business in this. So there's boycotts with Airbnb. Some of these boycotts are working, but when I look at the primarily what the economy is in Israel, it looks like as just an ordinary person, like how am I supposed to boycott electric machinery? Uh, Ryan, what's the challenge there? And uh, if you can illuminate on that a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yeah, I think actually the most interesting aspect of the difficulty with sanctioning Israel is comparing it to South Africa, because the United States and the Soviet Union didn't get along very well, as we all know, during the Cold War, but they did agree on one thing, which was that South Africa should be sanctioned. And the fact that the two biggest powers in the world had zero sympathy for the apartheid government, and it still took decades to get that to end. There's actually a researcher who found out that the United States drew up a plan that they're going to propose to the Soviet Union of a military invasion of South Africa if the apartheid state didn't end. So, I mean, that's the level of pressure and coordination that it took in the international community, even of countries that don't get along, to get this relatively weak government compared to the Soviet Union and the United States to reform. I think the difficulty with Israel is that you see a lot of support in the United States government from lobbies like APAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. They fund a lot of the campaigns of American politicians. So that alone makes them, interested. Lawmakers are not super interested in pressuring Israel legally with actual sanctions by the nation. Similarly, Israel has pretty decent relations with Russia and some other world powers that would be useful in pushing this movement, whereas South Africa didn't have didn't have that level of support. And then as for your question of, yeah, how can an individual person, not buy spacecraft and not buy aircraft? I think it's actually, that's the problem right there, is it's difficult. Israel, they don't sell a lot of consumer goods as much as they sell military, medical, like you mentioned, like high technology, very expensive things that only governments or large institutions can buy. And if those governments and large institutions aren't willing to implement sanctions or boycotts or divest, then the movement kind of gets stuck at that third point, like you had mentioned. So I think until you see the large world powers shifting their opinions on the support of Israel, it'll be very difficult to move forward with that.
Yeah, because it seems like it requires like to actually exhibit this pressure requires intense organization, like good organization. I'm wondering how well organized the BDS movement is. Um, and I mean, because it's like, for example, like you look at like boycotts that were happening, boycotts were all the rage. I know that like Starbucks was on that boycott list, and Starbucks is like, I think they've lost a market because of BDS. They lost like $11 billion, like in market value, even though they had no stores in Israel. They did not do business in Israel. They did not take a side, like in that they were trying to remain neutral as possible because they're just trying to sell coffee, I guess. But it got caught up kind of in the crosshairs. And it's like, so like in terms of like getting to the point where we can organize in order to apply that pressure to Israel takes a lot of coordination from the popular movement itself. So when I see like a thing called like Starbucks being caught in the crosshairs, or I look at those protests when Netanyahu came to Washington D.C. Usually those protests, they were spray painting "Hamas is coming." Like, and though those might be agitators, I'm not sure, but it does seem to me like there are factions within this movement that make it difficult for lawmakers to take them seriously enough to apply, these governmental sanctions. And like, I don't know if you wanted to speak more about this, Maeve. It was just a thought I had.
Yeah, I mean, to the point about organization, it's definitely not a perfect system. And I think I often find myself wondering why certain businesses are being boycotted. It's not always immediately obvious what the allegations are or actually how they even really stand to truth. I know in the case of Starbucks, it was actually a combination of this kind of alleged support that Starbucks had for Israel or kind of a perceived complicity with Israel, as well as Starbucks kind of more credible and concrete mistreatment of their union workers in the attempts to stifle the union. So it almost became kind of intertwined and then but the long and short of it is I think yeah, ultimately it's not the most organized movement and but it does have, as you said, very severe economic outcomes for certain businesses that do receive the boycott and I'm so sorry, what was the second part of your question?
It really wasn't a question. It was more of a thought, and I was thinking about like, because Starbucks is interesting. It was um, because the union used the logo to support Gaza. And
Mhm.
Starbucks was like, ooh, you can't really use our logo. And they've already been having problems with this union. So it was just so yeah, it was the miscommunication. And we were talking about organization. I guess just my main question was how can we transcend, like, if there's organizational dysfunction at the boycott divestment level, like how could it ever move beyond that into what would actually um have the most severe consequences, government sanctions. Like, so it was just like, I don't, to me, I can't see how it actually moves beyond that when I see so much disorganization within the movement itself. That was just what I was thinking.
For sure. Well, I think Ryan made an excellent point, which is that there's, I think, a lot of political conflict in the way that international communities and international politicians have reacted to Israel's actions. And I think it reveals a pretty steep hypocrisy because you see countries like Russia, when Russia invaded Ukraine, since then there have been 16,000 sanctions imposed on them for their invasion. And the atrocities committed against the Ukrainian people. So they're a very unified front in that respect. And I think you can see how that quickly mobilized a huge outpouring of support and has facilitated the continuation of that support at the government level since in the 2.5 years since the invasion began. But as Ryan highlighted, with this, because of these deeply entrenched geopolitical ties between Israel and other Western countries, politicians here are a lot more ambivalent to even voice their criticisms of Israel. I think the default now is to sort of proclaim this unconditional support of Israel, regardless of what their government does, which I think is where you see the majority of the criticism against, say, like the Biden administration, because they have been so kind of blindly supportive throughout the whole ordeal, really. So I think as organized as the local movement could be, the real issue is going to be, I think, aligning the interests of that local movement with the decisions and actions of the people who are really in power. And as long as those kinds of geopolitical interests still exist, I don't know if it's really going to make enough progress.
Yeah, it's going to be tough because, like, in terms of like, there's always factions in movements. There's different factional, like, movements, even in Israel, even in Palestine. There are different factions. Like Hamas is not a majority faction, but they are a faction, and they have caused a lot of damage in the West. We have factions here, even in terms of the BDS movement. We have more hardliners that are Hamas sympathetic, and that's doing a disservice to the actual, like, um trying to apply that pressure to politicians when they say, oh, well, they're just supporting Hamas. It's like, well, we can't really take them seriously. But it's just like, and then it's just, yeah, it's a factional thing is hard. We don't have to talk about boycotts the entire time. We can move on to divestments. I actually think divestments is pretty interesting, because that is where I think there was a resurgence, like, in this movement, because the college protests over the past year have been specifically about colleges divesting from Israel. And I find that interesting because that was a tactic that was used in South Africa. However, that was a long, long time ago. Investment strategies have changed in the past 40 years. There's the rise of ETFs and diversified investment portfolios. So it's like, I'm wondering, how effective is the movement strategy for calls of divestment, and what challenges does it face in this economic world, um, compared to the South African apartheid movement? Ryan, can you answer that for me?
Yeah, sure. You'll have to forgive a little bit of my financial illiteracy, but you know, like personally, like the university I went to, University of California, Riverside, it was successful. They actually got the university to divest from Israel. Personally, I wasn't aware that our university was investing in foreign nations. I thought they were investing in research and stuff like that. Um, but clearly, it is successful. I do think the best thing I can speak to regarding this issue is that, the United States, you're talking of factions. There's two, large factions that we know of. It's the Republican and the Democrat Party, and there's a lot of bipartisan support for Israel. And, there is kind of a revolving door between politics and administration and universities and think tanks and a lot of these things. And so if the same people are coming in and out of Congress and going to become chairs of universities and large companies and so on and so forth, you're going to have the same opinion for the most part. And these people are pretty staunchly, the majority of Congress on both sides, both parties, supports investing in Israel, not just through the government, but through businesses and through public universities. So I think the biggest roadblock, while there are some successful instances, is actually changing that opinion of the most elite in our country on investment in Israel specifically.
Yeah, I mean, investment is one of the main reasons why Israel advanced, economically, technologically, so fast. It was investments, grants, and just, gifts from the diaspora. Is that the word? Am I using that word right? I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's support from the diaspora
Yeah,
university.
and because Israel is of such strategic importance to the Western world, in that area of the world. I mean, if you really want to, like, I mean, Britain like, or when it was called Britain, but the UK and the US have had very like uh, I don't know if I want to get into the geopolitical like history of it. I was trying to talk more about the economic history of it. I mean, I feel like it's a quagmire if we go the other way.
Sure.
But I do find the divestment interesting. You said that Riverside was able to divest. How simple of a process was that for Riverside? Do you know anything specifically about that, or did you just hear that they're divested?
No, yeah. So I graduated a year before this, but I mean, I still follow the university's Instagram page, and it looked like they had travel abroad programs to Israel, for example, that ended. There's a fraternity on campus and a club on campus that's like pro-Israel. Specifically, like part of their thing was going to Israel, and I'm pretty sure there was like some university programs through Israel, like specifically that required funding. I don't know if it was for is the Israeli government or universities or what, but the university, from what they said in their statement, the movement had said, the UC administration had divested from Israel, and they had got rid of the trip abroad and things like that. So I'm not sure the specific details, but there certainly was action taken as a result of the pressure applied by the protest.
Now, does divestment actually hurt Israel? That's the thing, because when you divest in something, you're selling something. Someone has to buy it. So like, is it actually going to hurt Israel if you just sell your shares and then someone else buys it? The shares are still like held. Um, so how effective of a strategy is that? I mean, if now we're getting into economics, we got social justice, foreign policy. I'm just some dude, but if either of you have a little bit of insight into that, I would love to hear it.
I mean, I am certainly not an economic policy expert, so I can't claim to have a wealth of knowledge here. But I think the question you pose is really multifaceted and highlights a lot of important topics within the subject. Firstly, I think there's always been a lot of pushback against divestment because people claim it's harmful to Israel and that it's even anti-Semitic. I think that's really been a huge part of the opposition. People conflating what is an economic initiative to hold Israel accountable with genuine anti-Semitism towards the Jewish community. And I think in some ways it's an argument that's been weaponized just to delegitimize this more real criticism of the Israeli government. And to your other point, will it hurt Israel? Firstly, although I'm not super qualified to speak on this, I'm sure Israel's a fairly wealthy country. And as you said, they also have like very intricate and I think deeply rooted economic ties with other nations that I think probably stretch back farther than I can even really imagine. So economically, they're in very good standing. And part of that is because of this ongoing kind of economic support they have between themselves and other Western nations. But another point is that whether it will hurt Israel, I think, not to be nefarious, but that's also sort of the point. The whole point of a BDS movement or of divesting from a country is that you will ideally impose some kind of economic or political pressure on them that's strong enough to convince them to change, or to kind of fold to what the international community is calling on them to do. So it's not, I think, about inflicting harm on individual citizens, but I think forcing the government to move in a different direction. I don't think it's going to bankrupt Israel. I don't think it's going to lead to the dissolution of the Israeli state, which I don't believe is the BDS movement's goal. But I think it is trying to inflict just enough pressure to actually motivate them to listen to these goals.
May I do want to ask you another thing, Maeve. I want to follow up in terms of divestment. Are these kids that are protesting on college campuses, are they selling out their college's future? Because if you have an endowment from the school, right? And that endowment is invested in order to build that endowment. It's invested into ETFs funds. It's a very complicated web of investment. And you're saying divest from those safer investments that help build the endowment. So divest from that. So that would make me think that that endowment is at risk now of of lowering. And I'm wondering, is it selling out the future of the college? And this is another question I have. If the endowment lowers, what kind of students are the first to feel the effects of that? Like, where do they pull their funding from first? How does that work? Do you have any opinion? Because this is what was confusing me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're raising such an important point, which honestly does not get discussed when people are covering this topic. So it's really great that you're presenting it. And I think it is a point of concern because I know speaking for my university, I think they are pretty heavily funded by certain Jewish donors. I mean, I can't say specifically what their fundraising base looks like, but I've heard students hint and sort of gotten wind that it is in some ways like kind of heavily concentrated in the sort of Israeli Jewish demographic. We have a very strong Hillel community on our campus. It's just a part of the campus community that I know is very important to the administration. And I think part of that is just because they also have a donor base that they know they have to be mindful of. So losing that is definitely an economic concern. And I can't say how bad, how severe the effects would be, how much they would lose, but I am kind of inclined to think it must be significant. Otherwise, the opposition that I've seen from my administration against calls for divestment would not be so strong. Our student government at my school called for a divestment, and within minutes, our university administration issued a statement condemning them. And so I think the immediacy and the kind of harshness of their response, which we had never really seen towards anything else that the student union issued, must indicate some pretty serious economic concern. And my school also has other economic troubles. So to your last point, if they do lose that money, if our budget deficit gets any higher, which is it's already a pretty pressing issue, they will probably pull from programs that do benefit the most disadvantaged students. A lot of students struggle to get proper financial aid. They have to take serious student loans. So I do think, although I can't confirm or prove this, it's not improbable that those vulnerable students would suffer because their schools are losing that financial support. That may explain some of the hesitancy from some universities to immediately divest.
Yeah, because I mean, it would seem to me like the students that are calling for the divestment uh, might not experience those negative effects, and that it's a future generation that would. But I'm not, I'm not sure. But it is interesting to think about when you think about a divestment. A lot of times people think, oh, it's just like an easy kind of thing. This is an easy thing we're asking for, but it's very nuanced. It's very complicated. Ryan, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure, I can add a little bit. Yeah, I think Maeve is right that a lot of universities do benefit from people who are either sympathetic to Israel or members of the Jewish diaspora themselves. Many heads of universities are of this background, and so yeah, I think that kind of explains the response uh, that Maeve was alluding to there with the immediacy of like these statements. Like I had mentioned Riverside, before they actually did divest, they had pushed against it over and over and over. And finally, the administration, like it was just such a hectic environment on campus, like during finals week and all these things, that they had to take some kind of action. How much effect that action actually has on the university's endowment, personally, I don't know, but I don't think that they would do something that would endanger the future of the university. I think they would strategically make a decision that would please the crowd, try to quell the issue as fast as they can, and then return to normalcy. I mean, these are smart people. I don't think they're going to do something that's going to endanger their endowment. But I do think if this did happen and there was a large divestment, you would see a lot of these programs that are there to help disadvantaged students either disappear or become more difficult or more selective in their choices.
No, honestly, maybe baby steps is the best thing. Like maybe disclosure first. Let's like push for disclosure at the very least. Like
Yeah.
disclose where these endowments going. That way we can look at it and make a more informed decision about divestment. Or, we can collaborate more effective with you about, what the university can or can't divest from. Yeah, it's very interesting. I wonder if we're going to see more of that because the conflict isn't settled. Schools back in session in a month. So I'm wondering if we're going to see another wave of divestment calls on campuses. I do want to talk about because I believe like it's hard to talk about and not talk about the South African anti-apartheid movement. And one of the
Mhm.
things that was successful and I'd love to hear your opinion on this, Ryan, is that it was successful in bringing the parties to the table to negotiate. You know, that was like that was the primary success of the anti-apartheid movement. Is it brought people together to negotiate, and they negotiated. It was a success, was successful. Now, I don't see that as the issue in Israel-Palestine. There has been multiple negotiations. There's been so many negotiations. It feels like, honestly, like every 10 years there's a major negotiation potentially happening. So I'm wondering, like, how effective is BDS in the challenge of the peace process if the whole point is to get them to the table to negotiate, but it's the negotiations themselves that are failing?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference between the apartheid movement in South Africa and the situation in Palestine is that the apartheid movement, they had the leverage. Like the international community supported them. The UK basically washed their hands of South Africa and said, "What's going on there is no longer in our hands." You know, their government has been told what we believe they should do, and it took a while, but um, the amount of leverage that was against the South African apartheid government is what forced them to the table. I mean, all the biggest world powers, their ex Commonwealth partner, the UK, everyone was pressuring them to the table. And the white minority in South Africa really had no choice. It was going to be that or violent uh, solution. And of course, that wasn't the course that was taken by the apartheid movement, because they understood the amount of leverage that they had. I think the situation in Israel is reversed. I think the Israeli government has all of the leverage. I think there is widespread support socially by the Palestinian diaspora, the greater Arab community. Many liberal factions around the world, left-wing factions around the world, recognize the plight of the Palestinian people. But as far as actual institutional leverage, when the Israelis do come to the table, they're not discussing, the right to return. They're discussing, like, a ceasefire in Gaza. They're discussing, we'll drive our tanks, a couple miles back for a few days, and then we'll come back. They're not discussing they're discussing baby steps in conflicts and like minutia. The Israeli government does not feel any pressure to make broad sweeping changes in the administration of their government. So I think to make that change happen, as I mentioned earlier, the leverage has to be shifted. I don't know how that would happen. That's a very complicated process, but that's the biggest difference between the two movements.
So it's a matter of concessions. It's like they have no incentive to concede at this point. They have all the leverage, and the idea is tipping that balance a little bit in the other way, to where because they're gonna, both sides, in order to achieve a peace, they're gonna have to concede on some things. They're gonna have to make concessions that they don't want to make. I mean, that's the history of all these negotiations thus far. But yeah. So it's just applying the public applying pressure in hopes that governments will apply pressure, in hopes that that tips the scale, in hopes that that will make Israel. It feels like there's a lot of onus on Israel. Like, it's all about Israel. Like that's what I hear. And but is there any, like, historically speaking, is there any sympathy, like, to be had in the BDS movement for Israel? I mean, you talk about the Nakba, for example. The Nakba is brought up a lot. From my understanding, the Nakba, like, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Like in 1947, 4 countries invaded Israel. They were invaded in all different directions. And I mean, hey, Israel, like, they underestimated the military capabilities of Israel severely. They probably could have done something then. There was a lot of infighting with the Arab coalition and whatnot. But it does seem like are we doing a disservice to negotiations by I have the feeling there's not as much sympathy for Israel. That's all I'm trying to say. And granted, yes, disproportionately the violence is affecting Palestine. But if you want two parties to negotiate a peace, doesn't there have to be sympathy for both sides? Do we have to stop? We have to stop, like, looking at Palestinian, like, as terrorists, and stop looking at Israel as imperialist colonizers or whatever. I mean, the majority of these are people. The majority of these people, these are civilians caught in the crossfire of this. We talk about different factions. You know, you have the hardline government in Israel, but that doesn't represent the entirety of Israel. And in fact, that's in terms of like the whole history here, that's a recent like progression. And then you have like the hardliners, you know, and Hamas, you know, when they won the election, it was 44%, I believe, and Fatah only lost by like 3%. And then when you look at the infighting, like between other socialist parties, like that drew a lot of votes away from, and then Hamas was able, and then now we don't have elections in there anymore. So it's like, should we be more sympathetic to both sides? Does it feel like the BDS movement is, I don't even know what I'm asking here. Like, Maeve, do you understand what I'm saying? And is there anything you want to touch upon this?
I think I do understand, and again, you're raising a really important point. In my first answer is yes. My longtime belief is that there should be sort of no binaries towards or selective humanity, especially when you're handling a subject like this, and that you should be extending the same dignity, the same humanity, and the same sympathy towards all communities, but specifically towards their civilian populations. You know, I think it's really important to draw that distinction between the government and their actions and their policies and the people who are living under them. You know, you could look at America, you know, you certainly don't blame individual Americans for, you know, our politicians. So to your point, I mean, we could have a whole podcast just about the history of Israel and, you know, how that creates an incredibly complicated reality and, you know, the nuances of everything that's happened so far. But more specifically to your point about should there be sympathy, I think yes, in the sense of acknowledging the history and the kind of complexities, you know, the multiple factors that have sort of contributed to the situation we're seeing now. But sympathy should only go so far, I think. I think the world generally internationally has had a lot of sympathy, and that has really taken kind of the center stage in a lot of these conversations, but to the extreme. You know, I think oftentimes you've seen sympathy, especially from other world leaders, be amplified into just blind and unconditional support, which no country should be receiving. You know, all countries have to adhere to the same international standards. No one is exempt from that, regardless of who that population represents, right? So with Israel, I think because they've been, you know, they have been given sympathy, they were given latitude, and unfortunately, you have seen them really just continue the policies and the actions that they've been receiving criticism for over the last, I mean, 7 decades. You know, even since the October 7th attack, Israel has been aggressively invading more areas in the West Bank and other Palestinian territories, yeah, which the International Court of Justice just labeled as illegal. So I think because, you know, when you don't see as much pushback, the Israeli government has shown that they're willing to just continue their current process and their current initiatives, which directly violate international law and harm the Palestinian people. So sympathy, yes, but not unconditional and not without acknowledgement of international law, which all countries should be adhering to.
Yeah, so it's like it was lopsided, the sympathy for so long. And when we're talking about being sympathetic to the Israelis or the Palestinians, historically, you know, we've been more sympathetic vocally for the Israelis. And so this movement is sort of like, I don't even want to say an overcorrection, but just like come on, like we can't, you know, the sympathy can't be as lopsided as it is. It's very interesting. You know, and you're right. We could talk. We could have a whole podcast about this because you know, I'm wondering like when I was like looking into this, I'm not even convinced that either like side wants a two-state solution. Like I'm more and more thinking, oh, do they both just want a one-state solution? I'm not sure. Now, then when you get to the people, like the that live there, the civilians might be another story, but I'm just talking about the people in charge. But I do want to leave this episode maybe on a little bit of hope because you know, ONC is all about, you know, we're about empowering Gen Z. And I know that Gen Z identifies itself as increasingly more and more as global citizens. You know, we're concerned with worldwide, and when I say we, I don't mean me, I'm a millennial, but they're concerned with worldwide issues. And that is going to require a lot of international cooperation. Now, how might achieving peace, and I'll ask you this, Ryan, how might achieving peace between Israel and Palestine influence Gen Z's approach to global challenges and their sense of collective responsibility?
Yeah, I think you do see some of the most vocal activism coming from Gen Z, particularly the college attendees, right? A lot of the protests, and a lot of these protests, to be fair, on college campuses are being attended by people who do not go to that college, like local, either friends or local supporters of the Palestinian movement. I do think somewhat tangential, but an interesting thing is there's been a lot of frustration in Gen Z too. That's not kind of put in the news as much or not as popular, but kind of a nationalist reactionary movement, because it's so frustrating to watch global politics become so mired in contention, and there's a lack of sympathy on either side. It seems very, very hopeless and pessimistic. But I think if there could be actually peace and reconciliation in Gaza, I think it would do a lot to both quell the frustration of the young generation who has a lot of political energy and wants to see change. And I think it would, going forward, set a roadmap for future conflicts, like for example, like Ukraine and Russia. They are going to have even if the war ends today, it's going to be a very contentious situation going forward for probably many decades. So if there's peace in Gaza now, that would help thinking about situations like Ukraine and Russia going into the future. But yeah, I think the BDS movement has some helpful concepts and tactics, specifically the first two, boycott and divestment. I think the sanctions movement, as we talked about, is more complicated, and I think Gen Z will really need to kind of think that through and ponder how sanctions are actually brought about and what their impacts actually are.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maeve, what about you?
Yeah, I think I second all of what Ryan said. I think BDS movement is a good place to start, and I think it represents an important local effort to pressure individual companies to discontinue their business in Israel and continuously just call more attention to everything that has been happening. But the larger issue, which Ryan also highlighted, is just this incredible blockade of politicians who are, too kind of, I think, deeply entrenched in their own geopolitical ties with Israel to deviate right now or do anything that they think would endanger those relationships. And unfortunately, I think they have shown that maintaining those relationships and preserving whatever economic, political benefits they receive is more important, more of a priority than addressing some of the human rights violations, which the BDS movement aims to do. So I think that's the greater issue, but to your other point, how does it impact the world? I mean, I think it's not only affecting communities in the Palestinian Israeli territory, but you see so much more political divide now among Americans, specifically Gen Z, who have just become completely disillusioned with their leadership and with their country because of what they feel is just a non-response to this, what they see as something so horrible. And there's even people now who are questioning whether to vote for Harris in the upcoming election because they associate her so strongly with the Biden-Harris campaign and, with Biden's approach to this issue. So I think it is a really pressing issue and it's causing a lot of divide. And it's only really going to, I think, gain any real traction until politicians are comfortable taking a firmer stance and unifying among certain key principles in this ongoing problem and conversation.
Yeah, here's a question for both of you. Because we say, oh, BDS movement is a good start. I mean, from its official founding, it's been 20 years. So it's like, how long does a start last? But how long until we get to the middle? But also, it's like it has been like boycotts. Like the Arab coalition boycotted Israel for decades. Much to their own detriment, actually. But here's what I want to ask you both. I'm assuming both of you are members of Gen Z.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So here now, personally, I'm on the fence. I'm not sure if boycott and divestment is the strategy. I'm not sure it does anything that a protest can't do, because the whole idea is raising awareness. Now, here's a question for you. You don't have to have an answer. Like, it's a tough question, but outside of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, let's take those three things and separate them for a second. What's one thing that you think, as Americans, that we can do, as just American citizens? What's one thing we can do to apply pressure that isn't a boycott, that isn't divestment, and that isn't sanctions? Maeve, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. I think, as has been true in every major political battle in American history, it's the best thing that American civilians can do is disrupt, I think, and get their politicians' attention, which um, Americans have done in a variety of ways, protests and sit-ins, blocking traffic. You've seen a lot of Palestinian and, Jewish Palestinian communities conducting sit-ins in places in Washington, just trying to insert themselves into those spaces and make sure that they're gaining the visibility that they need so politicians can see where they stand. And it's not necessarily going to have the most persuasive or immediate effect. But I think with an issue like this, when your politicians are so clearly aligned with sort of one view on a subject and they're very reluctant to move, it's important for the public to show how they feel about it, how they want their country to be represented. But I think in terms of political actions, continuously pressuring politicians, governors, senators to move in a different direction would be a good start. And unfortunately, I think you're going to see really just more division, more conflict in the future as it escalates. But I think if politicians specifically feel that they're losing support from key voter bases like Gen Z, then maybe they will consider changing their tactics a little bit.
Yeah, I think actually an interesting thing, the biggest thing American citizens can do is you look on the far right and the far left. They both are not particularly large supporters of Israel. That is strange because they don't agree on hardly anything. And they don't support Israel for different reasons. But personally, I think a way going forward to think about this outside of the BDS movement would be looking at the way the American government actually funds Israel and asking questions about what is the actual return on investment from the American citizen's perspective on investing billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars into Israel. For example, they have, I had mentioned earlier, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. It is not registered under FARA, which is the Foreign Agents Registration Act. So if if Lithuania has a company that wants to lobby in DC, they have to register as a foreign agent. AIPAC does not do that. They act as an American institution, an American lobby that is actually lobbying for a foreign nation. And they're the most, outside of business, they are the most active lobby in American politics. So I think just looking at that, kind of paradigm of why is there a lobby from a foreign nation that has such an ability to, use money for influence in politics, and asking, how does this help the American people? Is this costing us money? Is this getting into more conflicts? Is this frustrating people that we've been contentious with in the past in the Middle East more than it is actually quelling it? There's all these arguments. Israel is a helpful ally. They're a democracy in the Middle East, military intelligence, but all those things are kind of taken for granted and not generally questioned. So I think outside of even thinking about Palestine, which is a very important issue, just from the American perspective of why are we so allied with Israel? And what is our return on that? I think just simply questioning that more publicly on both sides of the aisle, I think that would result in some changes in the thinking going forward.
That's a good point. Are you hopeful, or do you feel hopeless for the future of Israel-Palestine?
Personally, yeah, I think I wouldn't say hopeless, but I think it's a very I don't want to be too optimistic about it. That's since 1919 they've been having domestic or demographic issues there, and the more the conflict becomes asymmetric, I mean, like just for example, right, Israel produced a report that they had taken out between a quarter and a half of Hamas's original fighting force, but there is no report on how many they've added to it, because if a young man, sees something happen, an atrocity in his neighborhood, the odds are of him turning the other cheek are not particularly high, especially in a place like Gaza. So I think it's kind of the Hydra situation where they're cutting off one head and they're growing two more. How many terrorists do you create when you're doing what Israel's doing, I think is an important question to ask. And the IDF, their job is to follow orders, but whoever is giving them these orders doesn't seem to be particularly interested in solving long-term issues. They just want to, solve short-term issues. And it's not an issue. It's not a situation where you can think short-term and have a productive outcome, I think. So I'm hopeful that we can have a change in thinking about how to solve this long-term. But in the short term, I think it's going to be pretty brutal, honestly.
Maeve, what about you? Hopeful or hopeless?
I think I would echo a lot of that. I would not say it's ever entirely hopeless, because I think the people who are being most impacted right now, Palestinians are not entirely without hope. So it kind of falls on the international community to, I think, keep hope with them. But I do think it's kind of uncharted territory, given I think the extent of the damage that has been done in Gaza and the level of displacement. As Ryan said, it has just, I think, created a meteor of issues, that no one is really equipped to solve. And just it has just exacerbated everything that was already happening to a much higher degree. So it's gonna be a difficult future. I think it's also an opportunity for the international community to really signal where they stand on certain issues, like, how communities are treated and how you respond to perpetrators of, international crimes. So, though I think the way they react to the crisis in Gaza right now will signal a lot, but it can also be an opportunity for changing what Israel is allowed to do, not referring to the population, not associating them with their government, but whether the Israeli government will be allowed to continue on this path, which just disadvantages everyone, including, their own people. You see in Israel mass protests because people there don't even agree with their own government. So I think a lot really rests on the next few months to years, honestly.
Yeah, I like how nuanced you guys both keep it as Gen Z. I know when I was a millennial, if I was your age and someone asked me that question, a lot of us would probably be like, "Oh, hopeful. I'm very hopeful." Because at the end of the day, you go, "Well, this isn't sustainable. It's unsustainable. So eventually, like something has to be, But then the longer it goes on, you go, "Oh, wow, wait, no, is it sustainable? It is sustaining itself." So it's like then you kind of become hopeless, but you guys are right there in the middle. So, well, it was good to talk to you both about this. Very interesting conversation. I'd like to thank you, Maeve. I'd like to thank you, Ryan, for coming on the show and 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 talking about what is not like the most uncontroversial thing to talk about. So, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the audience for tuning in. You can follow this podcast and other podcasts from Our National Conversation on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and everywhere podcasts can be found. You can follow Our National Conversation on TikTok and Instagram at Our National Conversation, and on X or Twitter, if you're an OG, at our NATL Convo. You can visit our website on ournationalconversation.org. Join us next week. We'll be talking about artificial intelligence and how it relates to Gen Z. I'm Christopher No. Thank you very much for listening. What about you, Ryan?